Well, again, it is a great honor to be with you today. I'm particularly glad for the serendipity that brought me here at exactly the same time that a group from this congregation is visiting Haiti through one of our programs. And actually, I'm also thrilled to be with you at a time when we can give thanks for something as ordinary and amazing as rain in a time of drought. Boston is not suffering through drought, but we do pay attention to the rest of the country. So with you, I celebrate this rainfall that has now come. During the course of my years in parish ministry, 25 years of them, in fact, spent mostly in New Haven, Connecticut, where I served that congregation for 21 years before leaving for the College of Social Justice. One of the things that I came to realize is that within our congregations all over this country, we revisit a very small handful of central themes over and over again. The topic of any given sermon, of course, changes week to week, but there is nevertheless a rather limited menu of things that we lift up because they have to do with meaning. What is my life for? What is the meaning of my walk and its ending? How do I better live into the purpose toward which I feel called? We revisit these kinds of large questions over and over again, not because we are slow learners, and not because we are fond of repetition, and not even because they're really big questions, although surely they are that. We revisit these themes again and again because the answers we can come to are partial and ephemeral. We never get to receive a solid roadmap taking us to the final answers to these questions. Instead, it's much more like a path that unfolds through a dense fog. We have to look and study and ponder and pray and find a few more steps along that way. This is actually not how we are trained up in this society of ours to think about progress, what it means to make progress. We tend still to think about progress in our lives as a very linear affair, one step following behind or in front of the one behind it. So we take Spanish 101 and we graduate to Spanish 102. And that's kind of how we think about moving forward. But in so many of the really large arenas of our lives, like spiritual growth or becoming more mature human beings, that is not, in fact, how progress is made. And that's because the nature of what we're learning is ephemeral. We have to learn it again and again in new ways. I have come to believe that the work of justice making is also one of these arenas in which we would do well to revise our linear thinking. The work of justice is not ephemeral in the same way as spiritual growth, for instance. We do, after all, try to make some very specific and concrete things happen. We try to raise the minimum wage, make voting more fair, protect a woman's control over her own body, end a war. We look to these very real markers to show us signs of progress and also to give us a sense of how much farther the distance is to travel. But if we shift our perspective just a little and step back into the long view of how social change has always been accomplished, we start to see its spiral motion. That long view shows us that the work of shifting our world toward more justice is not a matter of any particular campaign or strategy. It is instead fundamental to living into who we are called to be. It is the work of our lifetimes. It's one of the elemental things that give our lives their meaning. And therefore, it requires of us patience, courage, and a seldom elevated virtue, perseverance. In an essay I read a little while ago, a woman named Shanthia Monroe recounted a little snippet of conversation that she had with her two pre-adolescent children as they were driving home from a theater after watching a movie. Her kids were in the back seat arguing over which was the coolest superpower. They debated whether, if they could have any of the range of superpowers, it would be better to be able to fly or to become invisible, to have telepathy or out-and-out magic like Harry Potter, to have laser vision or X-ray vision, and so on. And finally, one of them thought to ask her opinion. Mom, what do you think the coolest superpower would be? She pondered the question for a moment, and then to her own surprise, she found herself answering, perseverance. Of course, her children hooted and said, that's not a real superpower, and then went back to ignoring her. But it left her pondering her own response to them as she realized how often that ordinary but essential human virtue can be missing in our culture of instant gratification. So how might we cultivate perseverance in our own lives, in our own struggles? It is, I believe, a core religious value, just like the ones we lift up more often, compassion or patience. And therefore, as a core religious value, it is not most fundamentally something that we feel. It is something we enact. The great Jewish theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote, "The beginning of faith is not a feeling for the mystery of living or a sense of awe. The root of religion is the question, what to do with these feelings? Religion begins with a consciousness that something is asked of us." Religion begins with a consciousness that something is asked of us. This is not a new idea for Unitarian Universalists. We are the people of faith, after all, who make our home at that place on the religious spectrum that is most thoroughly grounded in this one world, in this life. We are the religious descendants of people who completely rejected the notion that God had created a hell waiting for us after death. Instead, those ancestors of ours pointed to the hell that we human beings create for one another, right here on this earth. Their faith called them to respond to that very real hell. Our faith, the same faith, is calling to us still today. At the heart of the Unitarian Universalism that we proclaim is that image of the interdependent web. Anytime we recite or lift up our purposes and principles, we name it. And that web can immediately evoke a visual for us, which is the real-life web we are all so familiar with, a thing of shimmering beauty when we see it in a meadow in the summertime, for instance, the work of the orb spiders. But that religious image of the interdependent web of ours is something a little different from that thing of great beauty we see before us in the meadow, because its strands do not just connect us to the beauty or to the joy of our world. In their fierce strength, the strands of that web connect us as well to the people in my neck of the woods who have suffered through a New England winter, homeless or in a tent or in a crowded shelter. The web connects us to those here in Texas who are languishing in immigration detention centers. It connects us to those who are trapped within the racial disparities of our bloated prison system. And it connects us to the grotesque chasm between those who live in an excess of comfort and those who live in rank deprivation. When we elevate the virtue of perseverance, we remember the constancy of that web of connection and the truth that the tug of its strands demands something of us as long as we breathe the air of this sweet earth. It compels us to look up and away from ourselves, to follow the strands out from the lucky place we stand to all of the places where our sisters and brothers are imperiled. Our religion is not about a private feeling of happiness or well-being, even of gratitude or reverence, but instead it's about what we do with those feelings, how they lead us to turn our gaze toward a fractured world and put the weight of our lives on the side of its healing. The Unitarian Universalist College of Social Justice, which I lead now as director, was created to help us in that large imperative of our faith. As I said during the offertory, it was founded jointly by the UUA and by the UU Service Committee as a whole new level of collaboration between those two institutions. Its programs revolve around experiential learning, which is the idea that the most powerful kind of learning, the kind that sometimes leads us to quite literally change our lives, comes to us most commonly not through lectures or sermons or books or movies, but from a direct face-to-face encounter with some corner of our world that we are not as familiar with and where the consequences of injustice can be met face-to-face. So we bring people on short-term journeys, like the one some members of this congregation are on in Haiti right now, which are really pilgrimages of faith and witness, linking us to people on the front lines of justice struggles, both within our own country and afield. We offer intensive justice trainings for high school youth as a way to help them imagine themselves manifesting our faith through the work of justice. We arrange summer-long college-age internships for college-age young adults who want to begin imagining what it might be like for them to choose a vocation of justice making. Last summer we had 9 internships, our very first summer of existence. This summer we have 23. They are as far afield as Ghana and India and all over the United States, 6 to 8 week immersions. And we are also now creating a new matrix of connection aimed particularly at people who are in or near retirement, who have skills and time to give to these justice institutions of ours and would like help getting placed somewhere where they can continue to be of use. All of these programs of the College of Social Justice are grounded in 2 core convictions. The first is that our action in the world should be connected to spiritual practice, meaning prayer or meditation or yoga or spiritual writing. Contemplative practices in all of their forms center and sustain us. They remind us to turn ourselves toward the mysterious immensity of our universe, whether or not we choose to call that God, whether we give it any name at all. They let us drink from the deep wells that sustain our work in the world. They balance our spirits, and they help us to see our small efforts linked into large changes. But perhaps most important of all, spiritual practices are essential because they engage us in a kind of deep looking that will allow us to see our own shadows. Think for just a moment about the words of that grand old hymn that we just sang together, God of grace and God of glory. So often, the justice songs that we sing together in our congregations, as beautiful and powerful as they are, cast us as the change agents, right? The actors out in the world. One of my very favorite of those songs is by Kathleen McTigue, and in that song we sing, "We'll build a land where we bind up the broken. We'll build a land where the captives go free." It's a very beautiful and inspiring song. But listen to what a different feeling is evoked by those lyrics written by Harry Emerson Fosdick well over a century ago. "Cure thy children's warring madness. Bend our pride to thy control. Shame our wanton, selfish gladness, rich in things and poor in soul." Try not to trip over the theology and consider not what those words say about God, but what they say about us. Madness. Bend our pride. Shame our selfishness. Heal our wounds. And then grant us wisdom and courage. When our justice work is grounded in spiritual practice, it helps us remember that the things we're trying to change out there almost always live in some manifestation in here as well, within us. Without the deep looking of spiritual practice, we can fall prey to the entrapments of egotism, righteousness, and the kind of us against them mentality that can tip so easily toward violence. And the second core conviction grounding the College of Social Justice is that the interdependent web we proclaim in our faith is itself what the poet in our reading named our irresistible sense of mission. The truth held in that interdependent web is that we rise and fall together. All things that breathe, all things that suffer. And so we must wake up from our delusions of separateness and harness ourselves to the common good. We do this without a guarantee that the changes we make will last forever. We do it without knowing whether we will have to engage in this same struggle that we're engaged in today, next month, all over again, next year, all over again. We do it because each gesture toward compassion, generosity, and justice bears witness to the world we dream of. We do it not once and for all, but each day of our lives, eyes open to this day's gift of connection, this day's invitation to act. Latin American theologian Gustavo Gutierrez taught that the two most important questions any people of faith can ask themselves are actually held in the story told of creation in the first book of Genesis. It's the part of the story that recounts the first terrible act of human violence when Cain, in a fit of jealousy, murders his brother Abel and then runs off to hide from God in fear and confusion. God comes looking for Cain and asks, "Where are you?" And then asks, "Where is your brother?" Gutierrez says that those same two questions are constantly falling into our lives like an invisible rain. Where are you? Where is your brother, your sister? In the context of our liberal faith, which has always called us to align our lives with our vision for justice, these questions carry an especially resonant power. And we need to ask them not in the individual voice alone, but also in the collective voice of our communities of faith. Where are we What surrounds us in that steep and unfair pyramid of wealth and possessions, material comfort or deprivation? Where are we in the tangled matrix of privilege and power? What great comfort comes to us through no act of our own? And then that second question, where is our brother, our sister? Where are these siblings of ours? Who among them is lost in a prison, in a detention center, in a homeless shelter? What terrible deprivation is theirs to bear through no fault of their own? The call of these two fundamental questions, these two core religious questions, concerns not only what we feel compelled to do, but also who we wish to be. I believe we want to be people whose faith speaks not only to us here within these walls, but also to that wider world we inhabit. We want to be those who are willing to learn how to live within ourselves the changes we are trying to make out there in the world. People who can see ourselves for what we are, not perfect people, but those who are willing to study our sometimes hostile hearts and water the seeds of compassion. Those who will acknowledge our fears and walk with them, but not be driven by them. Those who, like Gandhi, will refuse to make an enemy out of our adversary. Most fundamentally, we are people who want to make a difference in our world's healing. When we come to the end of these fleeting lives of ours, as Anne Lamott put it in our reading, we want to know that our single lives, like letters of the alphabet, have been part of spelling out a great meaning. May it be so. Amen.